There's a moment that changes everything. A single moment. Not a scream, not a crash, just silence. And in that silence, a community discovers that the man they trusted most isn't coming home. Sunday, April 28th. A quiet Monday evening in a small town outside Phoenix. Robert Harris, 73 years old, a man who had devoted 47 years of his life to his church and his congregation, was about to become the answer to a question nobody wanted to ask. His family would spend the next 72 hours trying to understand how a man who preached love and forgiveness could end up dead in his own home, surrounded by circumstances that would haunt his church forever. Welcome to Silent Witness, True Crime Stories. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe, and also download your free ebook by clicking the link in the pinned comment. Harris wasn't just a pastor. To the people of his small Arizona community, he was a father figure, a counselor, a friend. He'd walk through the town's modest streets, stopping to chat with neighbors about their lives, their struggles, their families. People remembered his laugh, not the kind of laugh that felt forced or distant, but genuine, warm, like he truly found joy in your presence. His son, Marcus Harris, would later describe his father as someone who could make anyone feel like they mattered. That capacity for compassion ran deeper than most people could understand. Robert had served in the United States Navy during the Vietnam War. He came back from that war changed, haunted by things he'd never fully discuss, but somewhere in those quiet moments of reflection, he found faith. He found God. And from that moment forward, his entire life became an act of service. For more than 25 years, Robert led Hope Springs Bible Chapel, a modest wooden church with white trim and a steeple that pointed toward the sky like a prayer. He married his high school sweetheart, Diana, and together they raised 2 children in the Christian faith. They built a life rooted in principle, in Scripture, in the belief that the church was a sanctuary for everyone who entered its doors. The community knew Robert as someone who lived what he preached. He didn't just speak about forgiveness from the pulpit, he demonstrated it. A man struggling with addiction? Robert would meet with him every week, not judging, just listening, offering guidance grounded in their shared faith. A woman going through a difficult divorce? He would counsel her, pray with her, remind her that brokenness could be healed through God's grace. This wasn't theater. This was his actual life. 6 months before his death, a woman named Sarah Coleman started attending Hope Springs Bible Chapel. She was 34 years old, recently separated from her husband, carrying the weight of a fractured life. She'd heard about the church through a friend and decided to give it a try. Sarah was intelligent, articulate, troubled in a way that made her seem vulnerable, but also captivating. She began attending services regularly, and eventually she requested counseling sessions with Robert. This was normal. Pastors counsel people every day. It's part of the job, part of the calling. But what started as standard spiritual guidance slowly became something different. The meetings became more frequent. Late afternoon appointments stretched into early evenings. Sarah would sit across from Robert in his office, speaking about her fears, her doubts, her loneliness, and Robert, being Robert, listened with complete attention. He gave her his time, his energy, his pastoral care. Those around them noticed nothing unusual. Counseling is confidential. Sessions behind a closed door are routine. But in a quiet church in Arizona, something was beginning to develop beneath the surface, something that nobody could have predicted, something that would eventually tear apart everything Robert Harris had built. As the months passed, Robert began to change, not dramatically, not in ways that made people suddenly suspicious, but his son Marcus noticed it. His energy seemed different, heavier somehow. During Sunday dinners with his family, Robert would be quiet, distracted. His daughter Jennifer mentioned that his sermon one Sunday felt like it was missing something, the usual passion, the usual conviction. Diana, his wife of 52 years, began asking questions. She'd notice him checking his phone, putting it away quickly when she walked into the room. She'd see him staying up late at night, staring out the window, his mind clearly somewhere else. When she asked what was bothering him, Robert would deflect. He'd say he was tired, that the responsibilities of the church were weighing on him, that he was praying about something, but that it wasn't her burden to carry. Diana tried to respect his privacy, but fear began to creep in. Fear that something was going wrong, something that her husband wasn't telling her. What Diana didn't know was that Robert was experiencing something he'd never anticipated in his 73 years. He was attracted to someone, genuinely attracted, not in the way of a father figure or a spiritual guide, but in a way that terrified him. Robert spent decades preaching about temptation, about resisting the desires of the flesh, about maintaining moral integrity. And now he was face to face with something he'd thought he'd conquered decades ago. Every counseling session with Sarah felt like walking toward a cliff edge in the dark. He wanted to help her. He needed to help her. But he also felt something else, something he couldn't quite name, something that made him feel like a hypocrite every time he stepped into the pulpit. On Sunday, April 28th, Robert preached one of his most powerful sermons of the year. The topic, temptation and sin. He spoke about the human capacity for weakness, about how even the righteous fall, about how mercy and redemption are available to everyone willing to ask for them. His congregation left that service moved, inspired, grateful for his words. That night, Diana went to visit her sister in a neighboring town. She'd been planning the trip for weeks. Robert drove her to the bus station around 6 p.m. and headed back home alone. He told her he'd probably spend the evening reading, maybe do some administrative work for the church. He kissed her goodbye. He didn't know it would be the last time he'd see her alive. Around 8 p.m., Robert received a text from Sarah. She was in crisis. She didn't feel safe at home. Could she come to the church to talk? He hesitated. He knew it wasn't appropriate. He should have told her to wait until tomorrow, to call someone else, to reach out to another counselor. But Robert had spent his entire life helping people in their worst moments. He couldn't say no. He drove back to Hope Springs Bible Chapel and unlocked the office. When Sarah arrived around 8:45 p.m., it was already dark outside. The church was empty except for the two of them. They talked for hours, about her pain, her loneliness, her fear that she'd never recover from her divorce. Robert listened, offered counsel, quoted scripture, and somewhere in that conversation, something shifted. The line between counselor and person seeking counsel blurred. What exactly happened in that office, nobody will ever know for certain. What we do know is that by 11:30 p.m., Robert's heart stopped beating. A 73-year-old man who'd survived the horrors of war, survived decades of emotional burden, and survived countless challenges in his faith, collapsed in his own church office. The janitor, a man named David Torres, arrived at Hope Springs Bible Chapel early the next morning, around 6 a.m., as he did every day. David had worked there for 8 years. He had a routine. Unlock the building, check the offices, start the day's cleaning. But that morning, something felt different. The front office light was on. That was unusual. David walked toward it and found Robert lying on the floor next to his desk, cold, unresponsive. David's hands shook as he called 911. Within 10 minutes, sirens filled the quiet morning air. Police officers, paramedics, and investigators descended on Hope Springs Bible Chapel. This wasn't a medical emergency. This was a crime scene. Officers found Robert's body positioned in an unusual way. His arms were spread. His hands were pinned against the wall. There were signs of physical trauma. His face showed marks consistent with a struggle. His shirt was torn. There was blood. David Torres, the man who'd found him, kept saying, "He was such a good man. He was such a good man." By noon, the Maricopa County Coroner's Office had arrived. By evening, preliminary investigations suggested foul play. The community began to gather outside the church, confused, devastated, trying to understand what could possibly have happened to Robert Harris. The initial investigation moved quickly. Police questioned everyone. Diana, who was still visiting her sister, received a phone call that would change her life forever. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but she would replay it endlessly for the rest of her life. "Your husband is dead," the officer said. "We need you to come home immediately." Diana's mind couldn't process the words. She'd been saying goodbye to Robert for 52 years, one day at a time, but not like this. Not suddenly. Not violently. Sarah Coleman was also questioned. She admitted being at the church the night before. She told investigators that she and Robert had a counseling session. She described him as acting stressed, concerned about something personal, but she didn't provide details. She said they talked about scripture, about faith, about moving forward. She said nothing that would explain how a man ends up dead on his office floor. The investigators looked at everything. Security footage showed movement in and out of the church. Cell phone records documented calls and texts. Medical records were reviewed. Financial statements were examined. The coroner performed an autopsy. Robert's body told a story, but the story was confusing, contradictory. There was evidence of physical struggle. There were signs of emotional distress. But no clear cause of death emerged immediately. The official report came back. Homicide suspected, circumstances under investigation. The community erupted into panic. Neighbors began locking their doors for the first time in years. People who'd never worried about safety suddenly looked over their shoulders. How could a pastor be murdered in his own church, in a town where violent crime was essentially non-existent? How could Robert Harris, a man who'd spent his entire life serving others, end up dead in a way that suggested violence, struggle, conflict? 2 weeks after Robert's death, toxicology results came back. The investigators discovered something unexpected. Robert's blood contained elevated levels of anxiety medication and alcohol, high levels, the kind that could cause confusion, impaired judgment, panic attacks, the kind that could make someone feel like they were losing control. But here's where the story takes a turn that changes everything. Investigators found a journal in Robert's desk drawer, hidden beneath some papers. The journal dated back 8 months, written entirely in Robert's handwriting. In it, he documented his inner struggle. He wrote about temptation. He wrote about feeling weak, feeling ashamed, feeling like a fraud. He wrote about Sarah Coleman by name. He wrote about counseling sessions that became something more complicated. He wrote about guilt, overwhelming, crushing guilt. In one entry, just 3 days before his death, Robert wrote, "I've spent my entire life teaching people about righteousness. I've preached about strength in the face of temptation, and now I find myself unable to practice what I preach. I'm a hypocrite. My congregation trusts me with their spiritual lives, and I'm drowning in my own moral failure. How can I lead them when I can't even lead myself?" Diana has asked me 3 times this week if something's wrong. I can't tell her. She'd be devastated. I can't tell anyone. How does a pastor confess that he's fallen? How does he admit that he's human in the worst possible way? Now, here's what investigators believe happened that night. Robert was already emotionally fragile. The medication he'd been taking for anxiety wasn't prescribed to him. He'd taken pills from a prescription bottle that belonged to his wife. He'd mixed those pills with alcohol, a dangerous combination that he likely didn't fully understand. When Sarah arrived at the church, she was in genuine distress, but as their conversation continued, something about the situation triggered Robert's anxiety. Perhaps Sarah said something that made him panic. Perhaps he suddenly felt the weight of what he was doing, the danger he was putting his marriage in, the betrayal of his calling. The medication and alcohol combined with his psychological state created a perfect storm. He may have experienced a severe panic attack. He may have been hyperventilating. In his confused state, he may have acted irrationally. Investigators found evidence that he'd struggled with Sarah. There were scratches on both of them. There was a physical altercation that wasn't violent in the traditional sense, but it was desperate, panicked. Robert's heart, already strained by his emotional state and his body's physical reaction to the medication mixture, simply stopped. He collapsed. And by the time help arrived, it was far too late. The official ruling came down. Robert Harris died of cardiac failure brought on by an anxiety medication overdose combined with alcohol consumption. It wasn't murder in the legal sense. It wasn't suicide. It was a tragedy born from desperation, weakness, and circumstances that spiraled beyond anyone's control. Sarah Coleman left the town within a month. She'd been devastated by Robert's death, racked with guilt even though she hadn't caused it. The last anyone heard, she was living in another state, trying to rebuild her life, carrying the weight of knowing that her presence in Robert's life had contributed to his downfall. Diana Harris spent 2 years asking herself the same question over and over. Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he trust me enough to share what he was struggling with? The answer came to her eventually, and it was both heartbreaking and profound. Robert couldn't tell her because he believed his role as a pastor meant he had to be perfect. He believed that his weakness would destroy her faith, would destroy the church, would destroy everything he'd worked toward. His humanity was his fatal flaw, his inability to admit that he was fallible, that he was struggling, that he needed help. This is what killed him as much as the medication and the alcohol. Hope Springs Bible Chapel closed for 6 months. When it eventually reopened, there was a new pastor, a younger man with a family. The congregation slowly returned. They still grieved Robert, still spoke fondly of him, but now there was a different kind of sadness. They realized they'd known a man they thought they understood, only to discover he was far more complex, far more wounded, far more human than they'd ever imagined. Marcus Harris, Robert's son, eventually shared his father's story publicly. He wrote about the danger of unrealistic expectations placed on spiritual leaders. He wrote about the importance of mental health support within churches. He wrote about the tragedy of a man who spent his entire life helping others but couldn't ask for help himself. The church community learned something profound from Robert's death. They learned that strength isn't the absence of weakness. Real strength is acknowledging your struggle and reaching out. Real strength is admitting you're not okay. Real strength is knowing that being human isn't a failure. It's a given. Robert Harris's story reminds us that we don't ever truly know the people around us. The person preaching to you on Sunday might be drowning on Monday. The person who gives advice might desperately need advice themselves. The person who appears to have it all together might be falling apart in private. We build images of people in our minds, especially those in positions of authority or spiritual leadership. We project perfection onto them because we need them to be strong. We need them to have the answers. But what if the greatest gift we could give these people, and to ourselves, is permission to be imperfect? Permission to struggle? Permission to ask for help? Robert Harris was a good man. He did countless good things. But he was also a man carrying secrets, struggling with shame, unable to break through the walls he'd built around himself. His death wasn't inevitable. It was preventable. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. What do you think about Robert's story? How would you have handled his situation if you were Diana? What would you have done if you were Robert and felt that weight of guilt pressing down on you? Put your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. I'm genuinely grateful you spent this time with us today.